Meanwhile, a Hamas delegation is expected to attend ceasefire talks in Cairo on Sunday following an invitation extended by Egyptian mediators. Others expected there include U.S. CIA Director Bill Burns and Qatar's foreign minister. Israel's war cabinet is reportedly set to discuss whether to send a delegation as well. Let's get more now on all this. We can bring in John Hanna. He's the former National Security Advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney and Senior Fellow at the Jewish Institute for National Security of America. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us on BBC News. Now, as we just heard, Israel says it recovered the body of a hostage during this raid in Gaza. The victim's family blames Israel for not doing enough to strike a deal with Hamas. How much blame do you think the Israeli government should shoulder for the failure to bring the many dozens of hostages home?
It's hard for me to place much blame at all on the Israeli government. Of course, Hamas is the one who took almost 250 innocent Israelis hostage 6 months ago, has kept them away from their families in probably entirely brutal conditions in Gaza. Hamas is the one that should be blamed. There was a temporary pause in which Israel was able to get back about 100 of its citizens back at the end of November. There's been ongoing negotiations now for several months, and Israel has made clear that it's prepared to have a pause for as long as 6 weeks in order to get its remaining hostages back.
Why do you think those negotiations with Hamas have stalled? We did hear that there will be a Hamas delegation apparently in Cairo this weekend. Why do you think the negotiations have stalled? We did see some successful talks that freed many hostages, but that's been weeks or months now.
I think Hamas is stalling. Hamas's demands have been far beyond anything Israel can accept in terms of demanding a permanent ceasefire, thousands of terrorists let out of Israeli jails, and a return of the entire population to northern Gaza, including as many Hamas fighters as they can get back into the north. So Israel simply cannot accept those conditions. Neither the United States or Egypt or Qatar, I don't think, can accept those conditions. They know that they won't go anywhere, but Hamas is holding out. I think it believes it has a winning formula. The longer this goes on, the more Palestinian suffering and destruction there is. It's clear that the more pressure there is on Israel to stop this war, short of an all-out defeat of Hamas.
Meanwhile, there were these fairly large protests across Israel demanding the government do more to free hostages and asking for early elections in the country. We've seen the increasing international pressure on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. How much pressure is he under? How do you rate the viability of his government right now? Can he continue to effectively lead Israel?
Well, it's a big question. It's obviously one Israelis have to answer. There's a lot of division in the country. The war brought people together, obviously, to need to respond to Hamas. But the divisions that we saw before the war are coming back now. The government clearly bears a lot of responsibility for what happened on October 7th. Whether or not you have an election in the middle of a war is a difficult call Israelis will have to make. I don't think this coalition will fall on its own accord. It's a right-wing government, 64 stable seats. They won't break this government unless they're forced to, obviously, by people in the streets.
It's been 6 months now since the attacks of October 7th. How do you assess the global standing of Israel and really the way that it's conducting this war? We've seen several countries, including members of UK government, calling for an end to security assistance to Israel.
Yeah, there's no doubt, and we've seen this in past Israeli wars, that the longer these kinds of wars go on, the higher the suffering imposed on innocent civilians, largely by terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, who instigate these wars. the worse, the more isolated Israel becomes internationally. It's hard to see how Israel could have fought this war much differently, given the way Hamas is prepared to see as many Palestinians as possible get killed as human shields, 300 to 400 miles of tunnels underneath Gaza. It's a brutal, terrible, awful war. Hamas doesn't care about the human suffering, and it just puts Israel, that is a moral Western military that tries to operate within the laws of armed conflict. It makes it very hard to fight this kind of brutal campaign against a genocidal terrorist group right on its border.
I want to ask you before we go, we have about a minute left, but I know you're part of a group that's published some guidelines or a plan for a post-war Gaza. Do you think, obviously the conflict is ongoing, but is there enough talk or enough attention paid to what might happen once the fighting stops?
No, there's probably not, in part because I just think there are no perfect solutions in Gaza. There probably aren't even any good solutions in Gaza. You've just got to manage this as best as you can to minimize the suffering of innocent Gazans as much as possible through humanitarian aid efforts, which is one thing that our report urges that people do, including the Israelis, take more steps. But we also say that if you want to ever get to a better day after, a better future for Gazans, then somehow this Hamas terrorist group that started this war on October the 7th, has to be defeated. That regime in Gaza that's been there for 16 or 17 years needs to be removed if we're ever going to have hope for a better future in Gaza and for Israeli-Palestinian peace being able to move forward.
John Hanna, former national security advisor to the U.S. Vice President Dick Cheney and senior fellow at the Jewish Institute for National Security of America. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carl.